Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The sun had long set. To the west, over the Pacific, the sky was still faintly blue, clinging to the memory of day. Brent moved to a seat across the aisle so as to scan the darker eastern sky. Waded through a long stretch of trees, then thought he spotted it, Deneb, in the constellation Cygnus, the swan. He squinted at his book, then out the bus window. Now that they were out of Los Angeles, the air was much clearer. He had looked again and was amazed to make out the shape of a cross with Deneb at its head, just as in the book. He grinned in the darkness, unknown to those around him. He spoke the word Deneb in his mind and felt himself to be Adam, naming the new world around him. He took his flashlight from his pack and read on. He'd bought the book in a store he'd passed in San Francisco, using the Visa cards his parents had gotten him. He'd also bought 6 blades for his saw, more sandpaper, and a San Francisco map. And he'd used the card to get more cash. He'd planned on building the whirligig there, but after a day of freezing in the fog and night of a cheap hotel, unable to sleep for all the shouting and footsteps, he climbed back onto the bus that morning, headed south to San Diego. This would put a whirligig closer to the corner of the country and would put him in a warmer climate. He'd brought nothing long-sleeved. He hadn't mentioned this oversight, or any others, when he'd called his parents from the bus station in Los Angeles. They were dubious enough about the trip as it was. Just as he was in the first call he'd made, they'd barraged him with questions, reminders, and caution. He'd half listened, curiously fingering his blonde hair. He'd forgotten to bring shampoo, and he'd washed with soap, leaving it as stiff as cardboard. Sitting out by eye from Deneb, he found Vega, then Altair. He hadn't realized before that individual stars had names. The books called these 3 the Summer Triangle. He stared at Vega, the brightest bluish white, and felt it stare back at him. They'd held the gaze like tango dancers, while the woman behind him snored obviously. The trio of stars shone above him, shone for him alone. By now, he was accustomed to feeling separate from the other passengers. For them, the bus was an interlude. For him, it was home. There was no existence outside of travel awaited him. It was all as familiar to him as he'd been writing for years, the scent of the bathroom, the menu at the meal stops, the inevitable drinker from the far to the rear, and the old woman who was the first row asked the driver to confirm she was on the right bus every 10 miles. It was an anonymous community just right for him. But unlike the others, when he stopped off the bus, he'd remain in a world of nameless strangers. He looked out, except that he knew Deneb, and Vega, and Altair. It was 10 when the bus stopped in San Diego. Joints creaking, Brent clumped down the steps. The passengers gathered their luggage beside the bus, then scattered, their community disbanded. He alone remained outside, leaning his pack against the wall, and fishing through his pockets for the paper. A young woman from Holland who'd gotten off in Santa Barbara had told him about the youth hostels and had lent him a copy, an address from her book. After the night in San Francisco Flophouse, he was ready for a change, though not ready to use his visa to stay somewhere like the Sheraton, as his parents had begged him. The trip was his to take, not theirs. The hostel, cheap, friendly, and filled with students, sounded more interesting. "Excuse, please." Brent looked up. A short mustached man with a suitcase stood before him. In one hand, he held a tiny address book. "I wonder, sir, if you can tell me where this address in San Diego is. My brother's house." Brent knew he would be of no help, but when the man held up the address book toward him, pointing to the bottom line with a pen, he instinctively stepped forward, bent over to the book, studied the microscopic writing, then caught a flash of movement and turned. Behind him, a scruffy teenager had a hand on his backpack. Brent stared at him, speechless. He saw the door he'd come through. Then he glanced back at the first man, realizing they were a team, and saw no one to appeal to except 2 drivers at the far end of the station. And he yelled, "Leave me alone!" loudly enough that both drivers turned. The thieves exchanged a long look. The hand reluctantly released his pack. Then the pair sulked wordlessly into the night. It took 3 packages of potato chips before Brent's heart slowed to a normal speed. He was inside the station, squeezed onto a bench, surrounded by fellow travelers and safe. It dawned on him why animals lived in herds. He scouted the room's perimeter for predators, decided against walking back to the hostel, marched outside, and got into a cab. Through its windows, he saw the summer triangle forming for him and felt watched over. The cab parked. Brent hefted his pack from the trunk and stood on the sidewalk after the cab left. The night air was warm. A bird was singing somewhere. Beside him, he now saw, stood a palm tree. He sighted up its long trunk, touched it, and felt he'd entered a different country. The impression was deepening when he walked up the steps and past the porch, where two women were sitting in wicker rockers and conversing in a language he couldn't place. Brent passed them and presented himself at the desk. "Passport and visa, please," said the clerk. He was young, with a pungent English accent, and a head heaped with black curls. "Passport?" Brent was stunned. "I'm American." "We only take foreign travelers," said the clerk, "a theory being, as I understand it, that this is being our own country, you've already got yourself a place to stay." Brent sighed conspicuously, wondered what to do, glanced at a couple hurtled over a map, and saw the hostel was simply a large house, and that he was standing in the corner of its living room. "Of course, it was being as late as it is, and unlikely that anyone else will show up, and we being unusually empty, as it happens, you might just convince me you're Canadian." A smile flickered on the clerk's lips. Brent stared at him slowly and comprehended. "What city was it you're from?" the man asked. Brent racked his brain, then thought of the cyclist he met at the campground in Washington. "Prince George," he answered. "And what's Canada's capital?" Brent rummaged madly through his mind in vain. "Ottawa, you're right," supplied the clerk. "And what year did England wrestle control of your fair country from France?" Brent knew this fact was nowhere in his memory. 1763, right again, said the clerk. He handed Brent a pen and gestured grandly toward the register. "Welcome." He gave Brent a tour and showed him the room where he'd share with 3 other males. Floating up in the stairway came the faint peeping of a concertina. Brent had glimpsed the player in the dining room, a bearded man, eyes closed, his fingers punching out the melody on their own. After coming out of the bathroom, Brent stood listening to the cheery, reedy sound. He envied the man his power to entertain himself and others. There seemed no end to the stock of tunes. He thought back to the cyclist admirably, self-contained as well, not simply with his dome tent and gas lamp, but with his go game and his thick boot and book on the subject. By comparison, his own life seemed unfurnished with skills and interest. He desired to become the man he was impersonating. He woke to find himself alone in the room. He smelled bacon. Like gravity, the scent pulled him irresistibly downstairs. The hostel served a free continental breakfast. Those who brought their own groceries were cooking most substantial fare in the kitchen. Cautiously, he entered the fray, nonchalantly poured himself some coffee, a drink he tried only once, grabbed a pastry, and took a seat. A minute later, a young man sat across from him and asked him, "Where are you from?" "Canada." Brent kept his voice low. He sipped his coffee, fought back a grimace, and reached for the sugar bowl. "What part?" "British Columbia," he mumbled, praying there were no Canadians present. He ate his sweet roll nervously. The lies were piling up, and he was a coffee drinker, Canadian, and most serious, that he was a mere tourist, not a convicted killer on a mission of repentance. Not only his every word, but his every bite and breath were counterfeit. Prison, where no pretense was needed, suddenly seemed a better choice. His table mate was German, a year older, traveling before starting college in the fall. Brent was amazed that he had no accent. After 1 year of French and 3 of Spanish, he could neither understand nor speak a sentence in either language. His companion mentioned that he'd just finished 2 years before the mast and would pass it on to him. Brent sensed the boy's comments that he knew more about American history than Brent himself did. The boy was tall with strawberry blonde hair. The two could be mistaken for each other at a distance. Brent studied him in secret admiration, thinking he might easily have been born into his body. Instead, might speak these 3 languages and know all that he knew. When the German asked if he wanted to see the sights downtown with him, Brent at once abandoned his plan to start the next whirligig. A half hour later, they were boarding a city bus. The Pacific in the distance, the red tile roofs, the palm trees, and the countless Mexican restaurants all made Brent feel gloriously distant from Chicago. Mexico was only 20 miles away, according to the German boy. He introduced himself as Emil. They got off the bus at Babalu Park, headed to San Diego, and spent the rest of the morning strolling through mesas, rainforests, and aviaries. Emil would be studying biology at his university and provided a constant commentary on bird plumages and migration, European snakes, and the evolution of the elephant. Fascinating he was beholding his own double, Brent watched raptly when Emil jotted his notes. "I'm sorry if I'm talking too much," he said to Brent. "Both my parents are teachers." "No problem." "They would like me to become one as well. A teacher lives forever through his students. These are my father's favorite words." Brent suddenly thought back to Miss Gill, the mediator in Chicago, and her saying that the effects of an act traveled far beyond one's knowledge. He knew she'd meant harmful acts like his. He saw now the same could be said of good deeds, such as teachers' years of inspiring. Everything we did, good, bad, and indifferent, sent a wave rolling out of sight. He wondered what his own accounting generations later would look like. They ate lunch, watched a marimbo duo and sword swallower in Babalu Park, sampled the museums of photography, a model railroad, then spent 2 hours in the Natural History Museum. Brent had never known anyone his age who went to museums voluntarily. He was strictly Emil's sidekick. Afterwards, however, while exploring downtown, he asserted himself and abruptly entered a music store when they were passing. He could still hear the concertina's merry burbling in his head. 10 minutes later, he walked out with a harmonica and an instruction book. He'd try his hand at making his own music. Dinner at the hostel was a boisterous affair, conducted in several languages. He and Emil had bought some frozen enchiladas, which they heated in the kitchen's overburdened microwave. It seemed strange to Brent to see men carefully mincing garlic and sautéing vegetables. He was a stranger to the stove, nor did the dinner conversation at this table resemble anything he heard in his house. Mixed in with descriptions of SeaWorld and the beach were long discussions of world affairs, sometimes in raised voices. Brent was surprised at how much other guests both knew and cared. Politics had never come up at home. Brent listened unobtrusively as diners and topics came and went. Finally, he slipped out himself. The concertina player was nowhere about. The house seemed much emptier without him. Brent observed travelers writing postcards, recalled that he thought he brought some, and realized he had no one he wanted to send them to. He was a planet on which there was no life as yet. Then he left the harmonica in his pocket and thought to himself, "Let there be music." He chose the back of the lawn, more private than the rockers on the front porch. He had read the bookless introduction, "The instrument you hold is full of orchestra in miniature," then started at the photo and marked Figure 1A. Figure 1A, snorted into the player's jacket and cuff-linked, read 3 times the detailed instructions: "Raise your harmonica, now moisten your lips, fill your lungs, then partially exhale." Set the instrument to his mouth and produced his first note. Congratulations. By the fading light, then by the flashlight, he pored over Lesson 1, trying to find a C at the 4th hole, without looking, tripping over the C scale, quirky pattern, laboring with scant success to get a single note instead of 2. He put it away, discouraged, glaring at the words, "Play instantly," on the booklet. He turned off the flashlight, he tilted his head and found a somber triangle, a familiar face to him now, and felt better.